Okay, so we're going to start. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us at our sixth masterclass in the Building a Subscription Business series. As you may know, the series has been brought together by three companies: Manifesto, Growth Architects, PugPig, and Piano. And this is one of a series of 10, ultimately 10 classes, five of which we've already done, and then the rest will be coming probably after the summer break. I'm really happy to welcome two guests, two big hitters in publishing technology. Ramin Beheshti, who is the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, and Rob Chandok, who is the Group CTO of DMGT, the Daily Mail General Trust, which amongst a number of companies includes the Daily Mail Group, within which there are, as you probably know, a large number of publications, big publications. So that's our group for today. I'm just going to, if we just nip into the first slide, I just wanted to give you a little heads up on what we're going to talk about. There's not going to be a lot of slides here. It's mainly going to be a conversation between the three of us. But Kim, if you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. So these are the sorts of topics I'm going to be quizzing Rob and Ramin on. Initially, knowing what to deliver. So how do we scope the project? We've already touched on product design, and really we're going to try and focus on delivery here for this session. We're also going to talk about architecture, technology architecture, content architecture, information architecture, and I know Rob has some strong opinions on that. MVP, a term often misused, misunderstood, so we're going to touch on what that means to both Rob and Ramin, as well as agile, again, another, I think, often misused term. We're then going to talk about releasing the product around, having an alpha release, a beta release, and then your kind of general release. And if we've got time at the end, I'd also like to touch on quality. Now, all through this, you'll see there's a chat window. So if you have any questions at all, just throw them in the chat window. I'll be picking those up, and I'll be either threading them into the conversation, or if needs be, I'll pose the questions at the end. But do start throwing questions in at any time. So that's it. I think we're just going to get set with an initial bit of context. So can we go to the next slide, please, Kim? So when we start to think about what we're going to deliver, and I talked a little bit about this in the first masterclass, there are a number of things at play. And in particular, there is what people are asking for, your audience in particular, what you deliver, and ultimately what they need. And there's all sorts of things that happen when these three forces into play. And the red ones and the red areas are potentially the things that you should be avoiding. The green ones are the good things. So for example, if you take the very center intersection of this diagram, you have things that people are asking for, things that you deliver because you're listening to these people, and they're things that they need. So that's contentment, that's expectation set. And then around, you've got the more interesting things. So you've got things that people are asking for, and they really do need them, and you're just completely ignoring them. And that's at the bottom, this big kind of, the bottom right, the immediate failure thing. Then you've got stuff that people haven't even asked for, turns out they need, and you're not delivering. And that is long-term failure. But then when we come across to the left, I think we get to the really interesting bit. So the stuff that people aren't asking for, you deliver them, and it turns out they need. And that's kind of Apple 15 years ago, I guess. That's the delight. That's expectation exceeded, which is fantastic for a while. But then, of course, that moves into the contentment area, because once you've delivered it, people expect it. And then the top left, which is this, I think, probably the number one risk on most projects I've ever worked on, which is the bit where no one's asking for it, no one needs it, but someone somewhere in the team thinks it's really important. And that's the sort of thing that's really important, I think, to identify quickly and avoid, because that's wasted investment, it's wasted time and effort. And then at the very top, you've got what people are asking for, and you deliver it, they don't really need it, which is nice to have. It's fluff, it makes people happy, but there's no real underlying value there. So, when you put all this together, I guess, what are we trying to say? There's a lot of pitfalls here. There's a lot of places you can go wrong. You know what people are asking for, you control what you deliver, but you have really no idea about what they need until you go live. So you enter into this build phase of a project with a lot of unknowns. And so with that in mind, I'm going to start, Raman, with you. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with this world where there are so many unknowns, and yet you've got a team and you've got a budget and you've got a deadline and you've got to deliver against it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting diagram, Johnny. Well put as well. I definitely think technology. The diagram's gone from my screen, but the technology tends to operate on the, you know, business person asks, technology person delivers. I think it was maybe it was a top two kind of quadrant. And you know, we were always measured kind of on the delivery, right? So did you deliver? Did you do it on time? Great, well, you've done your job. And I think one of the things that I've try to change with my stakeholder group is don't measure me on the delivery, measure me on the outcome that you're trying to achieve, because that changes the dynamic. Technology is more and more a creative field. It's a problem solving field, and people want to be measured on, you know, there's a problem, there's an opportunity, how do we actually how do we solve that opportunity, rather than being given a list of, well, actually we want these 25 features and we want them by next month, and changing that relationship and the dynamic that exists right at the top of an organization is actually key to ultimately getting to the outcome. Because you don't care as a stakeholder if you deliver feature A or feature B. What you care about is, you know, did the customer come back for a second time? Did they subscribe? Did they stay with you? That's you're focused on the outcome. So why do you measure your technology team on delivering features? Why do you not measure them all the same way in terms of delivering outcomes? And I think that's a huge kind of shift.
And I guess you still, in order to deliver those outcomes, at some point you still need to work out. You need to sit down and say, right, what the hell am I going to deliver? How do you manage that from a build team standpoint?
Yeah, but I think you do. And by the way, I'm not trying to be a CTO that says I'm not responsible for delivering. When I make a commitment, we deliver on the commitment. But I think the difference is actually we should all be trying to understand what the customer needs, right? Whoever the end customer is, right? Rather than what tends to happen, and it still happens in parts of my organization, is you've got a group of people who are like, well, this is what the customer needs because I've heard it, and they get to the point of saying, and you know, translate that. These are the solutions that you need to go away and build. Well, actually, how do you move the engineering team further up so that they're aware of those conversations? They're hearing the voice of the customer, and they might have different ideas about, okay, well, actually, really what the customer needs is not the button move from the right to the left, but actually they need a whole different experience build, right? Actually, we're going to go away and kind of build that because actually that's the outcome. So I guess it's really, really important to deliver, but it's important that actually the people who are building the solution understand the problem statement almost more directly from the customer. That's a big shift we've tried to make in our organization. There's parts of it that haven't got right. We haven't got it there yet, right? The voice of the customer is still held by one group, and you know they tell us what needs to get built. But actually where we're most successful is where there's a partnership, and actually people are trying to go, right, what's the customer saying together with the engineering teams and with the product teams.
Well, I guess also you're quite lucky, not lucky, but it's in the name, right? You're Chief Product and Technology Officer. So you've been given that mandate from the business to be able to make those sorts of decisions.
You'd think so, yeah. But there's still quite a lot of moments where that doesn't quite play out. And again, we'll come on to it later, but we are ultimately responsible for getting the thing out. It's just how you define that thing is incredibly important. And that's why I do like the diagram. I actually talk to my team a lot about, we're not there to just be order takers. We're there to talk about the need, like understand the needs and deliver against the needs, even if that isn't necessarily what your stakeholder is saying. So, you know, sometimes we hit that delight kind of area as well.
And Rob, what about from your perspective? How does your role compare? I guess you don't have the P in your title, but do you get that trust from the business to enable you to work in the same sort of way?
Yeah, I mean, I actually end up doing a bunch of the product stuff as well, even though I don't have it in my title. I think it's interesting, you know, the way I think about this stuff is coming back to sort of a first principle, which is design is the act of solving a problem in the face of constraints, right? And sometimes people who are coming new, especially into digital products, don't actually understand the constraints of the system well enough. So they propose solutions that either fall outside of what is reasonable or expected, or just is so different. And the way what Robin was talking about, which actually moving, whether you want to call them engineering, delivery, whatever, closer to and iterating with the team that is actually going over the problem statement. That's the most important thing. I know we'll touch on concepts around Agile, and there's things to take and things to walk away from in Agile, but the real thing here is, the way you get to a place where you know what to deliver and then you know how it's going to be measuring is by having that hypothesis about what you're trying to do and agreeing on that beforehand. How is it going to be measured? How am I going to test it? What is success? And then, because if you don't do that, you get quickly down into discussion of, I think this is supposed to be blue, and I think if you move this 2 pixels to the left, we'll get that. And I just came out of a meeting where we were having that debate, and I was like, we don't know what our users are going to do. So our best thing to do is instrument and test, but have a strong hypothesis about and be able to test what we believe in. That, I think, up front is the most important thing to delivery, is just, deciding, well, I can also do my product management missive, which is product management is not deciding what to do, it's deciding what not to do, right? So, and that has to do with engineering or any delivery discipline too. You have to bound the problem and deliver on what you think the core value is for that iteration of the product.
Yeah. And okay, so when you get into, so let's say we're shifting into delivery mode, or at least you've got some sense of the scope. Rob, we were talking about architecture the other day. I'd love to, it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about how you approach a project from an architecture standpoint.
Yeah, I wish I could remember what I said to you when we talked about it before. But
you said you were more. I said, because we were talking about process, and I think you said, like, I'm not a process guy. I'm an architecture guy. This is kind of what drives me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, and it'll come back to the way I think about Agile and stuff. I don't use Agile for the ceremonies, of the process or things like that. But I think Agile, that framework of a test, have a hypothesis and test is a very powerful framework. For me, the part of the system that generally drives success or failure as you go on is, in fact, the architecture up front, and it cuts across all the disciplines that you have. What's the architecture of the data? How do I think about it? What's the architecture of the software components? What's the architecture of the deployment, right? We're in a phase where 15 years ago, you would build something and throw it over the wall to the people that would install it and run it in the field. And now DevOps even exists as a field, and we think about that all at the same time. And the DevOps people are generally, my organizations, right at the table when we're thinking about how we're going to architect the system, because if I can't deploy it, then I can't operate it. I can't actually deliver what I originally said to do, right? So to me, architecture has to do with understanding and getting a shared understanding on the team of what are the actually important concepts in what you're trying to express, right? And if I'm doing a media application, how is it that I organize the content? Is it a tree structure? Is it just full flexible? Do I expect search to be the main way that people discover content? Do I expect to, is it Yahoo versus Google, right? Am I going to build an index, or am I going to be doing search? So we just heard how old I am because I made a reference to the original Yahoo versus Google battle. But it's those kind of architecture things. If you don't think of that up front, what you do is do a lot of work in that unnecessary quadrant, right? Because you're not solving a problem that actually needs to be solved, because you don't have a concept of the problem that you're trying to solve that everybody agrees on, right? A shared model.
Ramin, do you consider yourself an architect?
Not a good one, but the value of it, as Rob said, is incredibly important. And there's so many examples in my career where we've got it, where we haven't invested. And actually, delivery is a lot about investing time up front. The things that we're talking about is actually how much time do you spend up front thinking through some of these things, actually understanding the need state rather than just kind of assuming, developing the architecture. Because actually then when you get into build, because everyone thinks of delivery as the build bit, right? They're like, right, well, when have you started coding? When are you going to finish coding? Right? But actually these things make that process much swifter, because everybody has either a shared understanding, or both, a shared understanding of the need state, and they've got a shared understanding, and there's been proper thinking up front about the architecture. Because a lot of the times you see technical teams get into problems because they're kind of like halfway through build and they're like, oh, actually, you know what? We didn't think of this up front. And now all of this stuff that we've done in the middle, we have to throw away because actually we've got to rethink through how these things fit together. And they've been some of my worst programs. Right, the worst experiences around delivery, the most challenging ones, are where we haven't spent enough time thinking through the architecture. You realize that kind of halfway through build. The worst delivery has been when you've not thought through the need state, because you go live with something that nobody actually needs, and so therefore there's no value to it. So that upfront investment is huge in being able to kind of accelerate through the build stage.
Yeah. It feels a bit like there's a kind of pendulum swing thing where back in the olden days when we were doing, the kind of old school technology projects, technical architects were all over the shop. There were like hundreds of them, and there was a huge amount of work up front. And I think, over the last 15 years, technical architecture almost became a swear word for a little while, and people just wanted to get the hell on with stuff and just not do any sort of upfront architecture design. And now maybe the pendulum's kind of swinging back for good reasons. So then we were talking, the other thing we talked about, and again, this is one of these things which is oft misunderstood, is the whole MVP thing, right? So we've got a sense of what we're building, we've got a sense of how we're architecting it, but then trying to just filter through that list and get it down to something that's manageable and deliverable. That's, I guess, what MVP, minimal viable product, is all about. I promised we'd talk about it on this thing. So, Rob, do you want to start us? I know we've got a diagram which Kim will pop up. This is kind of how you like to talk about MVP.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges that generally I face in bringing something out or actually trying to move quickly is an agreement with the stakeholders or the internal customer about what minimum viable actually means, right? And I often pull out a diagram, or one of the ones that's of this shape, to talk about the difference between what the sort of, I often find the layman's interpretation of the word MVP means, a crappy quick thing that you put together and it sort of demonstrates it, but it doesn't do anything well. And I have a very different view of that, which I think you really focus on minimum and viable in this, and you say, I'm going to do something well, and I'm going to demonstrate probably the architectural framework of the concept that I'm trying to put together. This is how I'm going to organize the information in a media product. This is how I'm going to actually interact with the CMS and so forth. These are the APIs that I'm going to expect to have. I'm going to stub them out, but I'm going to show you a beautiful experience for this part of it, which is the right-hand side of that diagram. And then I slowly fill the whole triangle out bit by bit, and that's where you get into prioritization and so forth. But never in that journey do you drop quality from that discussion, or do you drop excellence in design or anything like that. And that's really, really hard for a lot of people who don't design and don't iterate through these things to get through their head that it's really a much better way to build than from that bottom up of trying to of building. So
I guess one of the keys here is that it's not a prototype. It's a very different concept to prototyping, right? Which can have all sorts of horrible stuff around it, as long as it's giving a sense of what you're trying to achieve. This has to be complete.
Yeah, and we live in this world where it's actually hard to meet expectations when you leap to something by trying to follow a prototype thing, because I can have a really good graphic designer implement a very a very compelling fake in Adobe XD or something like that people go like, it's just moving the buttons there. I don't understand why you think that's so hard, right? And so it's that leap of the difference between a mock-up that is just pictures to a product is, as I think, especially in the digital space, especially in the world where consumers have very, very high expectations of what an application or what a website should be able to do, because the building blocks are there, the bar is set very high. We've been taught over the years that only accept the best. So we can't throw out something that doesn't have a share button, can't actually deal with copy and paste, all these little tiny things that you have to think about when you actually go to minimum viable.
Yeah. And Ramin, how about you? How do you approach MVP?
Yeah, MVP has two. I really like the way Rob's diagram actually shows it going up the kind of left-hand side. The MVP in I think some of our organisations is such a badly used kind of term for a couple of reasons. One, our stakeholders also think that MVP is the final product, in the sense that you're never going to come back to it, right? So once you've delivered it, you're going to move on to something else. And there's this kind of, and this comes from kind of years of expectations being missed, in terms of, well, once you've done the MVP, I have to cram in as many of those requirements as I can, because you're never going to kind of revisit. So one of the things actually I remember doing as a product manager was I'd say, well, okay, this is when we're going to do for MVP, and on the roadmap, this is when we're going to come back and iterate on that MVP, so they can kind of clearly see that we're going to come back to it, right? There was always this kind of misnomer around phase 2, and phase 2 never kind of happening. But if you can lay it out and make sure the time's there on at least on a product roadmap, that makes a difference. And the other point around MVP is, what's the point of doing all of those features for launch, right? So to Rob's point, from before, we don't know, right? You don't know until you put something out there in front of the customer. So better to go out with something that's kind of a great user experience, but might not have all of the functionality to see how the customer interacts with it. You might find that you don't need to build any of those additional kind of features and requirements, because actually you've got a kick-ass product that people like. But unless you do it, unless you get it out, something out there to be able to test with customers, you're not going to know. So I think it's incredibly important, but I think it's an incredibly people get very nervous when they hear the concept of MVP, because they're like you said, either crappy design or you're never going to come back to it, and that's all I'm ever going to get.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, and we just got a question from Amy, which was, it's a question I was going to ask as well, which is that what I love about that diagram is that it sets an expectation, which I think is almost the opposite of the expectation of your stakeholders, which is how much of that triangle is filled in for the MVP. Because I think there's a sense that MVP is 60% of my feature set or 70%. It's like a kind of, it's a release one before the final release, and therefore, if I've got 100 things that on my list, I expect 70 of them to be on the MVP. And I love the fact that on that diagram, it's more like 10% of the feature list rather than 90% of the feature list. And so Amy has a question, which is, let me find it. Yeah, do you have a rule for how much you'll do in phase 1, or include in the excellent version of the MVP? So yeah, what's the kind of rule of thumb to go back and say, well, look, you've given me a list of 100. This is how many you're going to get an MVP.
So I'll go. For me, it's not whether it's 100 or it's 60% or it's 10%.
Yeah.
Honestly, the conversations that we have is, what do I need to build? What's the outcome that we're trying to get, right? What do we want the customer to be able to do? And what do I need to be able to build that holds the standards of design and UX, right, which actually are given in an MVP, right? Like that is a non-negotiable. You can't, for us, and I'm sure it's the same with Rob, you can't put something out in the Wall Street Journal that doesn't meet all of the kind of design standards. But I might not build all of the feature set, but what's the thing that I need to put in front of the customer so I can learn whether that's going to achieve the outcome that I want them to be able to achieve. So a crappy example off the top of my head is, if I want to build a share function on WSJ, the reason is I want people to share more of the content. I want to bring in more traffic. What do I need to build every integration to every single platform, or do I just build 2 and say, okay, great, right, can I see whether people are willing to share? Yes, they're willing to share, but now I'm seeing that when they click the share button, they've got either to share on Facebook or Twitter, but they can't share via email, or they can't share via, okay, good, right. Now, how do I continue to add more features and functionality so that when they do it again, they've got those kind of opportunities? So that's how I kind of think of it. And again, it goes away from, here's a list of 100 things to do. How many are you going to do for MVP? And in terms of, well, what outcome and what behavior do I want to drive, and what do I need to build in order to be able to test whether I can achieve that?
Okay, so a specific related question to both of you, actually. In the iOS Android thing, right? So are you more like a fortnight, and you'd happily go iOS for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, see how it goes, use that, learn from that, and build an Android version? Or are you we have to cover the whole audience here, and we have to launch both almost at the same time? I'll start with Rob.
I'm not sure why this is an MVP related question. So I used to work on phone ecosystems, right? I actually worked on the original Android stuff when I was at Qualcomm. So you would think my answer would be both, but I think it depends on what your market is, honestly. It's hard for me to answer. It depends on what you're trying to test in the MVP and what you're trying to launch. The fact of the matter is, as a matter of practice, getting everything right on both those platforms and making it feel like the experience that you want, no matter if you're using a platform that's, or you're building on something that's cross-platform, it's still hard, it's still work, and it's actually test resources. So one of the things I always come back with at this stage, if we're still talking about MVP, is focus, right? So what will help me get to the outcome that I want? Will it teach me more to launch in a little more blurry on two platforms, or will it teach me more to launch on one? And to some degree, it doesn't much matter whether it's Android or iOS first, right? But I think the thing that's hard is actually maintaining focus when you're at an early stage of the product. So that for me is the reason that I would probably launch on one with a fast follow, and I would hope to build on, I've heard of some technology platforms that work on both mobile
Oh,
ecosystems. So I might use one of those.
right. Yeah, good.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I think Android developers that I've worked with get particularly upset when they see their platform being used as a kind of a learning platform for iOS. And we've got our subscriber base is skewed more to iOS, but there's still a couple of 100,000 people that use Android on a daily basis. And by the way, especially when it comes to design patterns, their behavior is different. So it's not necessary that exactly you can port one learning to another. I think it's more interesting about how you launch on both platforms to a percentage of your audience so that you can learn on both, right? Before you kind of fully roll it out. So your MVP might not go to every part. And again, this is something that Rob said right at the top, which is you test and learn, right? So, and I do it across both, because I don't want to put necessarily something out there that to a couple of 100,000 people that isn't going to deliver them the outcome that they want.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the reason I ask is because to me, it's similar to your sharing story, right? And particularly if you're a smaller organization which doesn't have a huge amount of budget, doing something, and if you don't have the advantage of a platform, doing something on iOS and then doing something on Android, it potentially really does double your cost. And so there are cost implications of these things. And I think what we found in the past is that there'll be one or more individuals in the organization who have a dogmatic view, which is it has to be on every platform because our audience is on every platform. And for me, I like the fact that someone like Fortnite just said, well, no, it doesn't actually, and we'll take our time. And it seemed to work for them.
We've actually gone back and forth internally. It's not, but we've kind of said, well, both of them should be parity. That's current, but there used to be a point where there was a break because actually you do it on iOS. But like I wouldn't use Android as a test bed. I'd use iOS because that was the primary, and then you'd follow on Android. At the moment we're in, but it's this constant kind of like, I guess, tension between the two platforms. And I think again, it's where your customers are, right? So we want to kind of take the journal further into APAC region. Well, actually Android becomes incredibly important if you want to kind of go there. Versus in the US, we're much more kind of skewed to iOS. So I don't think we've ever got the balance continues to shift, I guess.
Yeah. So we've been talking about MVP and how when you release something as MVP, it needs to be of high quality, the quality that represents your brand, whatever. But there's another angle to this, which is, and again, this was something we were chatting about the other day, Ramin, which is the whole kind of alpha, beta, GA thing, where actually you're going to your audience and you're getting permission to launch something that isn't perfect quality because you want to get it out there and test. Do you want to talk us through what you were telling me the other day about the process you go through as you...
Sorry, Johnny. The part of our business is a B2B business. So products like Factiva, we've got risk and compliance business, which we sell to enterprises, right? So very different. We're not going to consumers, we go to enterprises. Mm-hmm. And, we used to have these huge leads, like delivery cycles, right? We'd release something kind of once every 8 or 9 months to the customer. And then, we didn't know if we'd met their kind of need state. There'd be issues. We'd have to... And it was quite a painful process. And the reason was we were trying to perfect everything before launch. And these are quite technical products, and it's quite hard to get absolutely everything right. And so from a product perspective, we shifted to alpha, beta, GA, right? Where products would go into alpha, or features would go into alpha, we'd go to well, actually alpha was internal. We get a bunch of feedback. Then we go to beta, where we go to certain select customers who'd asked for that particular feature, get their feedback. They know that there'd be issues with it, right? It wasn't of not in terms of look and feel, but in terms of there might be bugs, etc., with that experience before we then put it into GA. So what it actually meant was we cut the cycle between, hey, we think we need to go and build this, to actually putting it into the customer's hand, with the expectation that it's not necessarily fully baked in terms of the quality around bugs and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And that made a huge difference in terms of how we then learn from the customer and continue to iterate on the product.
And also, you talked about how you market product as well, and where in those stages you actually go out and talk about it.
Yeah, regardless of this is just my rule of thumb. If I do alpha, beta, even when it gets to GA, the split between, there's always a time lag between when you talk to the market about it, or where you promote something, versus when you actually release it in production. Even if we've gone through alpha, beta, and GA, and it's quite frustrating to marketing and sales, but I would always insist on 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe even a month, depending on how complex what we're doing is, from putting something out to GA before we go out and talk about it. And we had an example in November. Factiva turned 20 years old, and so there was a whole bunch of things that we were building around personalization of search and personalization of news, and we released them at the beginning of November, and I wouldn't let the marketing team promote it until the end, because what I think the worst thing that you can do around delivery is to put something out there, tell customers come and use it, and there's something kind of fundamentally wrong, or there's significant issues. So I always create a split between when you launch something, even in GA, and when you actually go and tell customers about it. Maybe I'm burnt by kind of previous tragedies.
I'm pretty impressed that you got marketing to not sell it before it was GA. So
that's true.
Yeah. I mean, I think an interesting thing to tease out in there too is that I think the language of alpha, beta, GA is very much a B2B language, and in consumer you would talk about canary testing or A/B testing and things like that. We don't ask consumers to please. There's very few products that you go onto the beta channel of releases for. You just get put on them. You just don't know, right? And so it's interesting that I almost feel like there will be a shift at some point in that in B2B and enterprise software as well, right? As we change from what Raman talked about for, these long release cycles that have to be perfect with all these features in them. And then it's also part of the shift from on-prem to SaaS and things like that.
But don't you think Google have done that for years, right? With their consumer products, they shove it out there, they stick a little beta sign on it, and basically that allows them license for it not to work very well, but at least they start to get user feedback.
Yeah, but other companies like Facebook and Twitter and everything like that, you don't get the beta version of the website. You just happen to be testing the features, and you're one of the 1%, right? So it's just, like I said, it is a little bit of how you market to your audience, right?
Yeah.
And it depends what their dependency or perceived dependency, and it also depends on how much they're paying for it.
Yes.
Well, I think, and for me, the tortoise story, for me, is a fantastic beta story. And I think, and maybe you get licensed if you're a brand new service. Maybe that's where it works, because with tortoise, it was almost perfect. They opened up the Kickstarter campaign in October. We started build pretty much as the Kickstarter campaign launched. They started building a founding membership of people who were committing through the Kickstarter, and therefore, by definition, when the Kickstarter period ended, they were paying for this product which didn't exist yet. The official launch date of the product was the first week in April, but we ended up launching a beta to the founding members at the end of January, but clearly signposted, and also, I guess, crucially, no one paid a penny until April. So they were entering into this phase where, hey, you're not paying yet. and the product's not ready yet, but we'd love your feedback, and we'd love you to help us shape this product, both from a tech standpoint, but also from a journalism standpoint. We're going to try lots of different ways of delivering content to you. And we put a big fat button right in the center of the bottom nav bar, which was tell us what you think. And it was kind of the hotline back to Tortoise to give an opinion about what people were experiencing, both in the journalism and the product. And for me, certainly in my experience, that was an amazing process, right? Because the degree to which the people in the beta felt like they were part of the team and they were contributing to the success of the product rather than shooting at it from outside was phenomenal. Now maybe that was because maybe that it's the luxury of being a brand new service. I don't know, but it certainly worked well in that case. So I'm wondering how would you approach it if you were launching, Rob, a new product, let's say for the Daily Mail? What would your approach be to introducing it to the consumer market?
I mean, it depends on what it was and how far departure it was from anything that people had seen before or had an understanding. I mean, if you're talking about your example with Tortoise, it was also a new approach to, like you said, it's both the journalism and the shape of the application and things like that. I think it's just too individual. I mean, for me, there would be ones that I would release as beta, and I think that would be related to when we started asking people to pay, right? And it depended on how confident we were in the design choices we were making and the testing that we had already done on our sort of friendly audiences that we already have access to. There are a lot of tools now where you can do, 10,000 user kind of trials without it being in the public app store. And that's a lot of data, right? And you can learn a lot from that, and you can get confident if you're also experienced enough at the product development. So to me, it's more of a brand issue and a marketing issue than it is a technical issue, right? Because I don't think of beta as this is lower quality. I think of beta as we haven't had time to do all the testing that we want to do, and we haven't seen it with enough people because everybody acts differently. Somebody will do something always. I mean, you give my wife a piece of software and she'll be able to break it instantly. So she's one of the best beta testers I know.
Actually, so we're going to talk about testing in a minute, because I think it's often overlooked but extremely important. Before we launch into testing, let's do the agile thing, right? Because again, it's it's one of those words that gets bandied around a lot, and I think a lot of people misunderstand what it means. So I'd love to hear from both of you, actually. What does agile mean to you? So Rob, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so I mean, I separate agile. Well, first of all, the context for me of agile, given how long I've been doing software, is a strong sort of counter reaction to the old way of doing waterfall software. The challenge I have with agile is, like any methodology or anything like that, you get sort of the people that originally thought about how to work in small groups and then became a business, and I can sell agile training, I can be an agile coach, and that's the part where it kind of turns into a cult. Right. So the ceremonies and everything of agile, I really don't care much about. I mean, if they work for you, that's great. The key thing of agile to me is it goes back to how I think about any development organization, any engineering organization, which is you have to construct yourself and your processes in a way that you can react to change, because we don't know what the market's going to throw at you, what the requirements are going to come at you. The technology base is changing. Now we've got security surface areas I'm going to have to react to. Oh no, I need to upgrade the version of Node.js I'm using because there's a zero-day exploit in it. So what I need to do is have a system where I can actually move quickly and react to change. The worst engineering organization I ever walk into that I have to fix is one that is terrified to change anything because they can't tell if they're going to break something. So Agile teaches you that you should be able to iterate, but you do it by having a hypothesis about what you're going to do, building and instrumenting that system so that you can deploy it, monitoring it when you deploy it, and repeating. And it's the core of Agile to me. It's just all about, it's the scientific method embodied for a software development process.
Mm-hmm. And do you find you're able to implement it in the way that you expect inside your organization? I know you're there only for a few months right now, so it's
there are parts of the organization that are very, very good at it, and there are parts that are not very good at it, and slowly we change those, right? I mean, it's in the end, it's the people as well, right? So if you don't have people that think that way, you'll never get that behavior, no matter how many coaches you bring in, right? So you have to have the right ownership in the team. They have to believe that that is the right way to do things. They have to believe in test automation. They have to believe in measurement, right? Otherwise, you're not really doing anything that's sort of a modern software development cycle.
And Raman, how about it? The journal?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of skirted around it in a lot of the concepts we're talking about, and I tend to agree fully with Rob. Is like people are like, I do a stand-up, so we're working in an agile fashion, or we have a sprint, so therefore we're agile, and I'm like, no. And I actually find it on both sides. One side's easier to change. The other side is harder. The business, I want to say the business, the organization needs to be more agile in the way of its thinking. Because if you go back to, hey, I want these 100 things built, and you're not going to release anything to the customer until, it doesn't matter if you've got a sprint that delivers every 2 weeks. Like you're not working in an agile fashion, because you have to build all of those 100 things before you. So that part's hard to change. It's proper cultural change, which we've kind of talked about. And then on the engineering side and the product side, I always find it really interesting when people are like, well, we can't plan because we're working in an agile fashion, or we're not going to do architecture because we're working in an agile fashion. I'm like, no. It doesn't say that anywhere that you can't do any of those things. I think Rob's point is correct. It's about, you have to be adaptive to change. It doesn't mean that you can't do upfront thinking. It doesn't mean that you can't give me a plan. The plan gets more certain as you get closer, as you learn more, but it doesn't mean you can't kind of plan things out. And that part is easier to change because it's kind of more within the CTO's control, but it's all for nothing unless the organization actually thinks and is able to behave in an agile kind of manner. And I've seen it, at this company and at past companies, where it's like you kind of get to a point where you're like, the engineering machine and the product machine can only do so much. But if the demands on it are, well, like I said, everything has to be perfect before it goes out, or you have to have built everything before it goes out, well, then you can't actually do much in terms of actually truly working in an agile way.
And what sort of teams do you have to develop product, for example? What size teams do you tend to opt for, and what's the breaking point in those teams?
One of the realizations I've actually had is, and org structures are terrible ways of dictating teams. Like, so one of the things we're doing now on the journal is actually we're bringing in membership, parts of the newsroom that are slightly kind of more forward thinking, and the engineering product team. So not huge numbers of people, but we're giving them a clear mission and an outcome, and then saying go, right? Because actually that is one of the better ways. It's not necessarily agile. It's just one of the better ways of kind of saying, you know what, you're all incentivized to deliver against this outcome. Go and figure out the best way of delivering against that outcome. And that outcome could be, for example, how do we increase our traffic to our mobile article pages for this particular content type? So actually that needs a team of people to come together and work. You would hope that actually what doesn't happen is that the news people or the membership people sit there and say, well, you know what, actually you're going to have to build these features. Because actually if you break it down in terms of kind of removing some of the hierarchy and saying, actually, you've all got specialisms, this is the outcome that we're working for, go get it, you would hope that actually you're all trying to understand why customers aren't going to the mobile article page for that particular content type. What do we do around SEO? What do we do around paid social, right? What do we do with the speed of the pages? Is that a problem? And you're kind of solving the problem together to deliver that outcome.
Yeah. So,
and by the way, so I will say, in a large organization, that is much, much more difficult than a small organization, right? Like that concept of hierarchy being broken out and like people focusing on that, like that's much easier, I think, in a small organization than it is in a particularly large one, which is kind of, especially legacy organization, which is wedded to hierarchy and org structure.
Well, yes, and yet you have the luxury of being able to hire people with very specific skills. And so I have a question which is a little bit a mix of a couple of questions that have come in. With if you think about a lot of people on this on this webinar right now watching will be sitting in much smaller media organizations, trying to work out what's the kind of, I don't know, if I can only have access to a few people, what are the vital skills that I need to have in-house to enable me to run these sorts of projects? You know, if you could only pick 4 or 5 roles or types of people, what are the must-haves? Because they don't have the luxury of, you know, huge teams of tech people who you can bring in and out of projects. So where do you start as a small organization building a small tech team? Rob, do you want to have a crack at that?
That's such a broad question. It's, you know, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, a lot of the ideal team size for me for beginning almost any project is somewhere between 5 and 10, closer to 5, right? And it's a couple full stack people, a UX person that can also basically draw, right? So you can do the mock-ups and things like that. A product manager and a test lead, a person who can actually do the testing. And that to me is the kernel of what I need to start a project. That is not what I need to finish our product in any way, shape, or form. You know, I've left off a couple of important roles in DevOps and things like that. I'm sort of assuming my full stack programmers can do enough DevOps to get the thing off the ground and stuff like that. But they have to be people who are unafraid to use what's available off the shelf and focus on, and that's the role. Whoever ends up being the sort of product lead or tech lead has to be able to make those, have those difficult conversations about focusing on the things that differentiate you and using everything off the shelf that you can otherwise, because there's, you know, the world is a very complex place and we can't do everything from scratch all the time.
Yes, true. I mean,
I would also add, and this might sound a bit weird, but go with me on it. There's a difference between someone's the role that people play on a team, right? And one person can play, especially in small organizations or kind of, you know, I've done it in my past where, you know, we're a startup within a larger organization. Like, they might be the developer, like they might be the DevOps person, they might even have to be the QA. But those roles have to be clearly defined. You're going to do these 3 things, and that's another kind of important thing. Especially if you can't scale the team out, the people are very clear about, because those roles need to be there, right?
Right.
It might not.
Somebody has to own DevOps, right? I mean, otherwise it won't get done right, and somebody has to have a point of view on it, right? Otherwise it'll be, oh, I wanted to use Jenkins, I wanted to use this, yeah. Like my favorite one is that people are like, well, I want to be cloud independent, but I only have 4 people. It's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. So, and actually, it's kind of a little bit about that, but also where we were a minute ago. A question just come in, which is, how do you? I mean, this is, again, a very broad question, but there are a lot of concepts here that we're talking about, particularly agile and MVP and so on. How do you? What language do you use when you're talking to people outside the function that you're working in order to get across these sorts of concepts? I mean, take agile or MVP, for example. I mean, I remember back in the day at News UK, when agile was going to be a thing in News UK, there was a whole lot of like training courses. It was quite intense, actually, and I'm not sure that they helped at all. But, you know, there was this genuine desire to educate, you know, people across the business. Clearly, that's unrealistic. But how do you go about articulating these concepts to people who don't necessarily understand them?
Yeah, I think that's been one of the mistakes of the past, is you've tried to educate people on sprint points and it's like, what their role in agile is very clear. It's like it's all about actually understanding the customer, having a hypothesis, building something, testing it. So actually, you don't need them to understand how all the sausage is necessarily made. You just need to understand why the behavior needs to be different and what behavior they need to kind of demonstrate, and why that gives the better kind of outcome. I think we've wasted a lot of time in the past trying to educate people on all the ins and outs of kind of agile, rather than the kind of philosophy and the thinking and why it leads to a better customer outcome, which again is why we do this stuff, right? Like, we lose sight of it all in technology. Even sometimes it's all about building something the customer wants to experience. That's it. There's nothing else that that needs to be done. So everything is just a mechanism to be able to kind of give that as the output. And Agile affords you a more flexible way of learning about these things. And it can be difficult, by the way, because especially in newsrooms, there's a certain degree of data blindness, I would say, in the past. Like if you think about how newsrooms grew up with a print paper, you'd get no feedback, apart from a few letters that came in. So there's a whole, at least from a publishing perspective, education around how can you use data, how can you understand that testing with certain part of the audience will invalidate your assumption or reinforce it. So I focus on those kind of conversations, not necessarily kind of what agile process actually means.
Yeah. I mean, language that is important to me is less about, I agree with that. Like if you start telling people about story points, then they'll assume that they can understand that and that it's actually valuable information. But it gets back to Raman's earlier point about not being an order taker, right? I mean, if I'm going to go do a remodel in a house and I have to have an architect tell me, and what I say is, I would like this wall opened up. I don't say, and I think you should use a 2x6 because I think that's actually going to bear the load if you calculate it across it. But that's the way people approach development organizations from a feature side, is they say, I want you to use this beam over here to do this and move it 3 inches to the left, instead of saying, what I want is this to be open space. And that's the thing I focused on first, is getting people to say what outcome they're trying to do and get them to step back and, think about what they're actually trying to get across from a product perspective, right? Like I keep talking about, because it's fresh in my mind in a conversation earlier, we were talking about these very low level details of an information structure, basically. And nobody stepped back and said, this is the model that I want our users to think about this content in. I want them to think of this is how it's divided. I want us to think this is how it's sorted. This is how I'm going to navigate to it. This is what 90% of navigation is going to be. This is what 5% of navigation is going to be. Instead, we're fixated on one particular UX transition that honestly, I bet people do 2 times a week, right? So you have to talk about what you're trying to do, and it's nothing more than how do you design, right? You have to step back and say, what are your actual assumptions? What is the minimal set of assumptions that you need to make or understand in order to make the decision that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. We've got a question coming in. I'm just going to read it verbatim. So minimum and viable are 2 words that conflict in the same phrase from testing quality perspective. For whom what is viable? What is minimum for marketing or for an architect or for a developer or a tester or a customer? I guess what we're hearing is, who's minimum? Who decides what the minimum is? I guess it's a group call, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'm to the point of the question, I'm not sure minimum and viable are actually conflicting with each other. I actually think that, partially because maybe, at school when I was learning logic, we learned about this thing called, here, I'll go full nerd on you, weakest preconditions. It's like, what is the minimum I need to say about something to prove it true? Because it turns out that is more powerful than listing. If I can tell you this is true because of these 2 reasons, that is a stronger statement than it's true because of these 10 reasons, right? So minimum viable means I can demonstrate to you that this is going to be a really cool app or a really cool feature by just showing you this minimum subset of it. And that is a much more powerful statement than saying, I'm going to do all this stuff, and by the way, it also bakes bread, right? And that is, to me, minimum viable is actually a really powerful concept to get across, because it strips out all the other distractions that people generally tend to pile on products in particular.
And how do you get consensus across a group of technology, editorial, commercial, marketing people? Because again, they've all got their own corner they're fighting, right? So,
sorry, go on, Rob. No, please.
I was just going to say, I make people write it down. I make people tell me a story, right? And you can, from that, figure out what's minimum. But if you ask them to give me a set of features, it's completely different.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's actually one of the hardest bits of the job is getting people to, and again, I think there's only one person in that list, and that's the customer. It's also the hardest person because the customer never articulates to you what minimum and viable is as far as they're concerned. But it's not based on what marketing think or technology or architecture. But I think writing it down, right? We do PRDs, for example, and out of that, you can kind of clearly start to look at and say, well, actually, what do we actually need to be able to do to be able to test this out with our customers to see, again, I've said it probably too many times on this call, what's the outcome that I'm aiming for? And will these two things allow me to validate whether I can drive that outcome, or these three things, or these four things? I think that's a huge step change, and it's not particularly easy because of all the reasons we said kind of earlier. You've got a culture that expects everything to be built before anything gets in front of the customer. And again, you have to kind of break through that.
Yeah, I like the making people write things down. That's the Jeff Bezos school of meeting management, isn't it? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I'm a big believer in the 2-page memo.
Yeah. So look, this is ironic because as in life, we're running out of time. We haven't done testing yet. Which is kind of a reflection of reality, hey? We've got 3 minutes left. So, well, look, is there anything you guys, any beautiful little tidbits you have around testing, pitfalls, stories before we have to close the...
I have one interesting one. I'm still... So a CTO here before me got rid of all of the testers. Every single person had testing in their job. So we didn't have one tester. He also got rid of all the project managers. And his expectation was that, the developers should do everything without actually allowing the developers to get to the point where they built kind of these test frameworks. I was actually remarking the other day on how, touch wood, little we release things that then have kind of issues. So in some ways that extreme impact worked. I'm not saying it's a good thing, by the way. I would never have done it in that way. But we kind of, we brought some of the QA people kind of back in, I think, but what it forced was a less of this handing over of responsibility. And I think when it comes to testing can't be a separate function. I don't think you should get rid of people whose specialism is testers, by the way. But I think one of the differences is how do you integrate them as engineers and as part of an engineering organization, rather than, hey, you're a bunch of QA people, and especially in the process, you don't go from one to the other. They're part of that kind of the team. But it's an interesting anecdote, because I kind of was like, when I turned up here, there was no QA people, literally not one person whose job it was solely to do QA. We built some of it back up, but we built it up in a more integrated way within the team, rather than this kind of a separate function. That's where I think it goes really badly wrong.
The only other thing I'll add to that, and I think it kind of dovetails to what Ram said, is I think it is more and more easy to put the responsibility of unit testing or functional testing back onto the people that are doing that part of the system. I do think that some people then take that too far to the extreme and forget that system testing is actually a different mindset. I completely agree, by the way, that it shouldn't be viewed as adversarial to development. I think it has to be viewed as part of it. But people who are really good at system testing are kind of different than people who can code and do unit testing. So I still think there's a strong belief in this, what we back in, when I worked at hardware companies and stuff, we called system integration and test, right? Because they're the people that take all the pieces, glue them together. That role is kind of DevOps now, right? So, but DevOps doesn't really have a quality function in them. And so you still need somebody whose goal is actually quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's also where you make people accountable. And I've seen it for security as well, is the cyber team aren't responsible on their own for security risks. If you make the development team responsible and accountable and incentivized on security risks, then they will work with the cyber team, who are the experts. They'll work with the system team, but they take the accountability rather than this kind of handover. That's where you get into your most problems, is passing over the fence.
Yeah.
I think that your point there is the strongest point, is that you have to make it everybody's responsibility. Quality is everybody's responsibility.
And what a perfect statement to end on. We are on the dot, out of time. So look, Rob and Raman, thanks so much for your time. That was a really interesting chat. This session has been recorded, so if you want to watch it after the fact, please come to buildingasubscriptionbusiness.com, and the recording will be there probably in a day or so. And there are other events coming up in August. We haven't scheduled them yet, but watch out for them. But I think that's it. Again, thanks, Rob and Ramin. I really appreciate your time. speak to you both soon.
Thank you.
It was fun. Thanks, Johnny.
Yeah.
Right.